The moment my son told me I should move out of the house, his father and I built together, something inside me cracked in a way I can't fully describe. He said it gently, almost like a practical suggestion, but I could see the truth hiding behind his words. His wife's family needed a place to live, and suddenly my home had become the easiest solution. What hurt most was not the request itself, but the quiet certainty in his voice, as if the decision had already been made. That was the moment I realized I was not just losing a house. I was losing the trust one thought would never break. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Lawson. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life I have lived in the same wooden house on a quiet street in Charleston, South Carolina. The house is not large compared with many others in the historic district. But it has a deep porch, tall white windows, and a garden that fills the air with the scent of jasmine every spring. Though anyone passing by, it probably looks like just another old southern home. To me, it is the place where my entire life unfolded. My late husband, Thomas Lawson, and I bought this house more than 40 years ago when we were young and believed the world would always move forward exactly as we planned. Thomas was the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands. He painted the porch himself and built the wooden bookshelves that still stand in the living room today. On warm evenings, we used to sit outside with glasses of iced tea while neighbors walked their dogs past our yard. Those evenings felt endless back then. Everything changed 12 years ago when Thomas died after a long battle with cancer. The months before he passed were filled with hospital visits, whispered conversations with doctors, and the quiet fear that settles into a house when both people know time is running out. When he was gone, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever carried in my life. At that time, we owned a small independent bookstore called Lost in Books and Coffee. It had been our dream business. The store stood on a corner near the old market district, and regular customers knew both of us by name. People came not only for books, but also for the comfortable chairs, the smell of fresh coffee, and the conversations that lasted longer than planned. After Thomas died, keeping the store open alone became impossible. He was grieving, exhausted, and facing a financial reality that did not leave room for sentiment. My son Daniel had just been accepted to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to study architecture. The tuition was more money than I had ever imagined paying. I remember sitting at the small kitchen table late one night, looking at the numbers again and again until the decision finally became clear. I sold the bookstore. Handing over the keys to that place felt like closing the door on the life Thomas and I had built together. But I told myself that sacrifices like that were what parents were supposed to make. The money allowed me to pay every semester of Daniel's college education. I wanted him to begin his adult life without debt, without the heavy weight that so many young people carry. Once Daniel left for school, the house grew very quiet. At first, the silence was painful, but over time, I created a routine that helped me move forward. I began selling rare books online from a small office upstairs. I attended Sunday services at my church and volunteered at community events whenever I could. Most mornings I spent time in the garden behind the house trimming roses and watering the hydrangeas that Thomas once planted with me. Daniel eventually became a successful architect working for a respected design firm. Every time he visited Charleston, I felt proud watching him walk through the same front door he had used since childhood. He believed all those sacrifices had been worth it. Then one afternoon, Daniel called and told me he had met someone. Her name was Olivia Carter. At the time, I thought that news meant our family was about to grow. He had no idea it was actually the beginning of the most difficult chapter of my life. If you're still watching and curious about what happened after I first met the woman who would later turn my life upside down, comment number 1 below, so I know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to what began as small, harmless comments, but soon revealed something much deeper. When Daniel told me he wanted me to meet Olivia Carter, I imagined something simple and pleasant. He pictured a warm Sunday dinner, polite conversation, and the quiet satisfaction a mother feels when her child finds someone who makes him happy. At that point, I still believe the story of our family was moving in a hopeful direction. Daniel chose a Sunday evening for the visit, which had always been our tradition. For years, he had come home for dinner whenever his schedule allowed. He spent most of that afternoon in the kitchen preparing a meal that felt welcoming but not overly formal. He roasted chicken with rosemary, baked cornbread the way my husband Thomas used to like it, and set the dining table with the blue plates that had been part of our family for decades. When they arrived, I noticed Olivia before she even stepped through the doorway. She was tall, well-dressed, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that fills a room without much effort. Her smile was polite and practiced, the sort of smile people use when meeting someone important. She hugged Daniel quickly before extending her hand to me. "It is so nice to finally meet you, Margaret," she said. Her voice sounded warm, and there was nothing openly unfriendly about her. Still, the moment she stepped into the living room, I noticed the way her eyes moved around the house. She studied the tall windows, the polished wooden floor, and the staircase that curved toward the second floor. Most visitors simply commented on how cozy the house felt. Olivia seemed to be measuring it. Throughout dinner, she complimented the house several times. She said it was beautiful and charming, and she asked how long I had lived there. He told her Thomas and I bought it more than 40 years ago, back when the neighborhood was quieter and the streets were lined with old oak trees. She nodded thoughtfully and asked whether the house had ever been renovated. He answered politely, assuming she was simply curious about the history of the place. But I noticed that Daniel watched her carefully whenever she asked those questions, as if he knew what she was thinking before she said it. After dinner, we stepped out onto the front porch. The evening air was warm, and the soft sound of crickets drifted from the garden. Olivia leaned against the railing and looked across the yard toward the street. "This is a wonderful house," she said, "but it must be a lot for one person to manage." The comment caught me off guard, though her tone sounded gentle. He laughed lightly and told her I had been taking care of the place for years without much trouble. Daniel quickly changed the subject, and the moment passed as easily as it had appeared. But over the next few months, the same type of remark began to appear again and again. Olivia would mention how many stairs the house had or how large the yard was. Sometimes she talked about retirement communities she had seen outside the city. She always said it as if she were worried about my comfort. At first, Daniel brushed those comments aside. It told her I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Yet, little by little, I noticed something changing. Sometimes, when Olivia talked about simpler living arrangements, Daniel simply nodded. One evening, several months later, I went upstairs early while Daniel and Olivia stayed in the living room talking. I had just reached the top of the staircase when I heard Olivia's voice drift up through the hallway. "That house has to be worth at least $600,000, she said quietly. He stopped where I was and listened. In that moment, I realized Olivia was not looking at my home the way I did. To me, it was a place filled with memories. To her, it sounded like an opportunity. If you're still here and starting to sense that something about that conversation didn't feel right, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following the story. Now, let's move on to the moment everything changed during a family holiday. In the months after I overheard Olivia Carter discussing the value of my house, life continued on the surface as if nothing had changed. Daniel visited every few weeks, sometimes alone, sometimes with Olivia. Each time they arrived, I reminded myself that I might have misunderstood that conversation on the staircase. After all, suspicion can grow easily in a quiet house. I did not want to become the kind of mother who assumes the worst about the woman her son loves. So, I kept my thoughts to myself. Still, I paid closer attention whenever Olivia came over. She never said anything directly unkind. In fact, she was always polite, always smiling, always calling me Margaret in that careful tone she used. But the comments about the house never truly stopped. Sometimes she mentioned the number of stairs leading to the second floor. Other times she talked about how much work a large yard must require. The words were always wrapped in concern, as if she were worried about my comfort rather than questioning my independence. At first, Daniel brushed those remarks aside. He would laugh and tell Olivia that I had been managing the house longer than either of them had been adults, but over time, something subtle began to change. Instead of dismissing the subject, he sometimes nodded quietly while she spoke. The shift was small, almost invisible, but I noticed it. By the time autumn arrived, Thanksgiving was approaching, and that holiday had always been important in our family. Even after Thomas passed away, I continued hosting dinner each year. Preparing the meal kept a sense of tradition alive in a house that sometimes felt too quiet. That year, Daniel told me Olivia's parents would be joining us. Their names were Harold Carter and Linda Carter. He had met them briefly before and agreed without hesitation. In my mind, Thanksgiving was exactly the kind of evening that could bring people closer together. He spent 2 full days preparing for the dinner. The turkey was seasoned the way Thomas liked it, with rosemary and butter under the skin. He baked pies and arranged the dining table carefully, hoping the evening would feel warm and welcoming. When the Carters arrived, the house filled with voices that had not echoed through those rooms in a long time. Harold Carter shook my hand firmly and complimented the neighborhood. Linda Carter praised the smell coming from the kitchen before we even sat down. During dinner, the conversation stayed polite. Harold talked about the business he once ran, and Linda asked questions about how long I had lived in the house. Daniel seemed relaxed and Olivia kept smiling across the table, but the questions continued. Harold asked how large the backyard was and whether the house had been renovated recently. He answered politely, though I began to feel that strange sense of unease again, the same feeling I had experienced months earlier. After the meal, we moved into the living room with coffee and pie. I believed the evening was nearly over when Olivia suddenly stood up holding her wine glass. "I would like to share something," she said. Everyone looked toward her. She explained that her parents had recently been struggling financially after Harold's business collapsed. At first, I felt genuine sympathy. Hard times can happen to anyone. Then Olivia continued. She said they had been discussing a solution that could help everyone. According to her, my house was larger than I really needed now that I lived alone. She suggested that I could move into Daniel's apartment in the city where life would be easier for me. Her parents, she explained, could stay here for a while until they were covered. The room went completely silent. I looked at Daniel, expecting him to correct her or laugh at the absurdity of the idea, but Daniel did not say anything at all. In that moment, I understood something that hurt far more than Olivia's words. These had not been a sudden suggestion. It had already been discussed. If you're still watching and wondering how a simple dinner turned into the beginning of a serious betrayal, comment number 3 below so I know you're still here with me. Now, let's move on to what happened after that night. The silence that followed Olivia's announcement during Thanksgiving dinner stayed with me long after the dishes were cleared. For several seconds, no one spoke. I remember looking directly at Daniel, waiting for him to laugh or correct what had just been said. Instead, he avoided my eyes and stared down at his coffee cup. That small movement told me more than any explanation could have. He did not argue that night. He simply said the idea would require careful thought. Olivia smiled as if the conversation had gone exactly the way she expected. Her parents nodded politely and the evening drifted toward an uneasy ending. After everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes that suddenly felt heavier than usual. Over the following weeks, the subject returned again and again. Olivia never mentioned the plan aggressively. Instead, she wrapped the idea in concern. When she visited, she would walk slowly through the house, touching the back of a chair or looking up the staircase. "This place must be a lot to maintain," she said one afternoon. Anotertime, she commented on how peaceful retirement communities could be. She talked about neighbors who were the same age and how convenient it would be not to worry about yard work or home repairs. Each remark sounded thoughtful, but the repetition made the message clear. Daniel's attitude began shifting as well. At first, he still defended my independence, but gradually his responses became quieter. Sometimes he would mention practical concerns about property taxes or maintenance costs. When the roof needed a minor repair that winter, he used the situation as an example of why a smaller place might make sense someday. Listening to my own son discuss my home that way felt strangely painful. This house was where he learned to walk, where his father taught him to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Now it was being discussed like a burden. Meanwhile, the Carter family seemed to appear around the house more often than before. Harold and Linda occasionally stopped by with Olivia, even when Daniel was working late. Harold would stand near the back fence and look across the yard as if he were measuring the distance between the trees. Linda admired the living room and asked whether I had ever considered renovating the upstairs. The visits were friendly on the surface, yet something about them unsettled me. He had spent too many years managing a small business not to recognize when people were studying something carefully. The feeling that settled in my chest was not fear exactly. It was awareness. One afternoon, after another visit from Olivia and her parents, I decided to take a step I never imagined I would need to take. He contacted a private investigator in Charleston. The decision was not made lightly. He simply wanted to understand more about the people who seemed suddenly interested in my home. The investigator worked quietly for several weeks before returning with a report. What he discovered about Harold Carter surprised me. The business he claimed to have lost had not collapsed because of ordinary financial problems. Records showed a pattern of gambling debts built over several years through online betting and casino visits in neighboring states. But the most troubling information involved Olivia. Several years earlier, she had been married to a businessman in Tampa, Florida. Their marriage ended quickly after he accused her of attempting to transfer ownership of one of his properties into her name through misleading legal paperwork. The dispute was settled privately, which meant no criminal charges appeared in public records. He sat at the kitchen table reading those pages again and again. The pattern was impossible to ignore. For the first time, I wondered whether my house was not just a suggestion in Olivia's mind. It might be the real reason she was here at all. If you're still watching and thinking the situation could not possibly get worse, comment number 4 below to show you're still with me. Now, let's move on to the moment I discovered just how far things had already gone. The report from the investigator sat inside the top drawer of my desk for several days before I gathered the strength to read it again. Every page described a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Harold Carter's gambling debts were real, not rumors. The short marriage Olivia once had in Tampa, Florida, ended under circumstances that looked far too familiar to what was now happening in my life. Yet, none of those details hurt as much as the possibility that Daniel might be involved, even unknowingly. For several weeks, I said nothing to him about what I had learned. I told myself that confronting him without certainty might only damage our relationship further. Instead, I tried to continue my life as calmly as possible. I worked on my online book listings, watered the garden, and attended church on Sundays. On the surface, everything looked the same, but inside my mind, there was a quiet tension that never seemed to leave. Then, one evening, Daniel arrived unexpectedly. I noticed the moment he stepped through the front door that something was wrong. My son had always been confident, the kind of man who carried himself with quiet certainty. That evening, his shoulders were tight and his eyes moved around the room as if he were searching for the right words before speaking them. We sat at the kitchen table where I had spent so many years helping him with homework when he was a boy. For several minutes, the conversation stayed ordinary. He asked about the garden and my work selling books online. He answered politely, though I could feel the uneasiness growing between us. Finally, he cleared his throat and folded his hands together on the table. It told me that he had signed a lease agreement. At first, the words did not fully register in my mind. I simply looked at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation. Daniel continued slowly, explaining that Olivia believed I was willing to move into his apartment in the city once the details were organized. According to him, the lease would allow Harold and Linda Carter to stay in the house while they recovered from their financial troubles. For a moment, I could not speak. The idea itself was shocking, but what hurt far more was the realization that this decision had already been made without me. He had never signed any document. He had never given permission for anyone to live in my home. I asked him quietly how he could have signed such a contract without speaking to me first. Daniel avoided my eyes as he answered. He said he believed it would help everyone. Olivia had assured him that I would eventually agree because the arrangement made practical sense. He thought living in his apartment would make my life easier and remove the burden of maintaining such a large property. Listening to him speak felt like hearing a stranger explain the future of my own life. The house he was discussing so casually was the same house where he took his first steps in the hallway. It was the place where his father taught him to read by the light of the living room lamp. Every corner of that building carried memories that no legal document could measure. Yet now there was a contract with Daniel's signature on it. He admitted that the agreement included a timeline requiring me to leave the house within a set number of days so the Carters could move in legally. If I refused, the lease allowed them to pursue formal action to enforce the arrangement. He sat quietly while he spoke, letting the weight of his words settle around us. In that moment, the situation became painfully clear. What had begun as polite suggestions and gentle pressure had now taken the shape of official paperwork. My son had signed a document that treated my home as something negotiable, and that realization changed everything. The morning after Daniel told me about the lease agreement felt strangely quiet. Sunlight came through the kitchen window the same way it always had, touching the wooden table where my family had shared thousands of meals. Yet, the room no longer felt familiar. It felt like a place where something important had quietly shifted. He slept very little that night. My mind replayed Daniel's words again and again. The hardest part was not the lease itself. It was the realization that my own son had signed something that affected my home without asking me first. But anger would not solve the situation. Years of running a bookstore had taught me that difficult problems required patience more than emotion. By the time morning arrived, my thoughts had settled into something calmer. Instead of confronting Daniel again, I decided to seek advice from someone who understood the law better than I did. Later that week, I met with a real estate attorney in downtown Charleston. His office overlooked one of the old streets near the harbor, and the quiet professionalism of the place gave me a small sense of reassurance. He explained everything carefully. The Thanksgiving conversation, the repeated pressure from Olivia Carter, and finally, the lease agreement Daniel had signed. The attorney listened without interrupting while she examined the original paperwork from when I purchased the house years earlier. After several minutes, she paused and turned a few pages back to the beginning of the document. That was when she noticed something important. When I bought the house after selling my bookstore, the property had been placed inside a family estate trust. He remembered signing several documents during that period, but I had never studied every clause closely. At the time, I simply trusted the lawyer who handled my finances after Thomas passed away. The attorney explained that the trust included a protective provision designed specifically for situations involving financial pressure or manipulation. If the homeowner could demonstrate that someone attempted to force them out of the property through deception or coercion, the trust allowed the property to transfer to a charitable organization selected by the homeowner. The Carter family would have no legal claim to it. For the first time since Daniel confessed about the lease, I felt a quiet sense of clarity. The situation was not hopeless after all. There was still a path forward, but it required careful planning. The attorney emphasized that proof would be essential. Evidence showing manipulation or misuse of the property would strengthen the case significantly. That advice stayed with me as I drove home through the familiar streets of Charleston. By the time I reached my driveway, a plan had begun to take shape. Instead of resisting the arrangement immediately, I decided to do something that would surprise everyone. He would appear to cooperate. I would tell Daniel and Olivia that I was willing to move into Daniel's apartment for a while. If they believed the house was truly available, they would act freely. And when people believe they have already won, they often stop hiding their intentions. Before leaving the house, I arranged for a small security camera system to be installed inside the living room and kitchen. The devices were discreet and nearly impossible to notice unless someone knew exactly where to look. Their purpose was simple. They would record whatever happened inside the house after I was gone. He did not install those cameras out of anger. He installed them because truth sometimes needs witnesses. Standing in the hallway that evening, I looked around at the walls that had held my family's memories for decades. Leaving, even temporarily, felt strange. But something inside me had changed. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I was not reacting to someone else's plan. I was preparing my own. If you're still here and wondering whether my plan actually worked the way I hoped, comment number 6 below so I know you're still watching. Now, let's move on to chapter 7, where the truth begins revealing itself. The day I left my house felt strangely calm, almost quiet in a way I had not expected. I packed slowly, choosing only the things that carried real meaning. Photographs of Thomas, a few books that had been with me for years, and the small wooden box where I kept letters from the early days of our marriage. Everything else remained where it had always been. Daniel helped carry the boxes to his car. He looked relieved, though he tried not to show it openly. Olivia stood near the front door, watching the process with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She spoke about how this change would make life easier for everyone involved. He nodded and said very little. The less emotion I showed, the more comfortable they seemed to feel. Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time. The living room still held the bookshelves Thomas had built with his own hands. The kitchen window looked out toward the garden where the hydrangeas were beginning to bloom. For decades, that house had been the center of my life. Yet now, I stepped out the door as if it were simply another place I had once lived. Daniel's apartment in Charleston was clean and modern, but it felt unfamiliar. The rooms were smaller. The windows faced busy streets instead of trees, and the quiet rhythm I had built in my own home was gone. Daniel believed I would slowly adjust to the change, and I allowed him to believe that. Meanwhile, Harold and Linda Carter moved into the house only those days after I left. Their urgency confirmed what I had already suspected. They arrived with a moving truck early in the morning, unloading boxes and furniture as if they had been preparing for this moment for months. Daniel told me they were grateful for the opportunity, though I noticed he avoided discussing the situation in much detail. Each evening after Daniel went to bed, I opened my laptop and reviewed the recordings from the cameras I had installed before leaving. At first, the footage looked ordinary. Harold and Linda walked through the house, examining each room carefully. They spoke about repainting walls and replacing furniture. Watching strangers plan changes inside a house that still legally belonged to me was difficult, but I remained focused on the purpose of the recordings. Within a few days, their behavior changed. Harold began studying certain pieces of furniture with more interest. He ran his hand along the dining table Thomas and I had bought during our décima wedding anniversary. Linda opened drawers and cabinets, removing decorations that had been part of the house for years. Then the recording showed something more troubling. One afternoon, Harold opened the front door for a man I did not recognize. The two walked slowly through the living room while Harold gestured toward several items of furniture. Even without hearing their full conversation, the meaning was clear. Harold was discussing prices. The man returned the following day with a small truck. Through the camera, I watched as they carried 2 wooden chairs and a side table outside. Those pieces had belonged to Thomas long before Daniel was born. Seeing them disappear through the front door created a sharp pain in my chest, but I forced myself to keep watching. The footage continued over the following days. More objects were moved, examined, and sometimes removed entirely. Each action was recorded with a date and timestamp, creating a record that could not easily be denied. Sitting alone in Daniel's apartment, I realized something important. The Carter family believed the house was finally theirs. And because they believed that, they had stopped hiding what they were doing. Living in Daniel's apartment forced me into a routine that was very different from the life I had built in my own house. The apartment overlooked a busy street in Charleston, where traffic never seemed to stop. At night, the sounds of engines and distant conversations drifted through the windows, replacing the quiet rustle of trees that used to surround my home. Daniel believed I was slowly adjusting to the change. He allowed him to believe that. During the day, I continued selling rare books online and taking short walks through the nearby streets. But each evening after the apartment had grown quiet, I sat down with my laptop and opened the files from the cameras I had installed before leaving the house. Watching those recordings became part of my daily routine. At first, the footage simply showed Harold and Linda Carter settling into the house. They walked through each room, examining furniture and decorations. Linda moved several framed photographs to different shelves while Harold inspected the dining table and the cabinets in the living room. Their behavior suggested a confidence that had not been present during their earlier visits. As the days passed, the recordings began revealing something more troubling. Harold started inviting people into the house who clearly were not friends or relatives. One afternoon, a man wearing work boots walked slowly through the living room while Harold pointed towards several pieces of furniture. Even without hearing their entire conversation, the meaning of the visit was obvious. The following day, that same man returned with a small truck. From the camera mounted near the ceiling of the living room, I watched as they carried 2 wooden chairs through the front door. Those chairs had once stood beside the fireplace for more than 20 years. Thomas and I bought them together during a trip to Savannah early in our marriage. Seeing them disappear from the house felt like watching a memory being carried away. Over the next several days, similar scenes appeared in the recordings. Harold opened cabinets and drawers while speaking with different visitors. Linda removed decorations from shelves and examined them carefully before placing them into boxes. Some items were moved into another room while others left the house entirely. Each time something happened, I paused the recording and wrote down the date and time in a notebook. He also saved copies of the video files on a portable drive. The process required patience, but I understood how important every detail could become. Eventually, I scheduled another meeting with the attorney who had reviewed my property documents weeks earlier. I arrived at her office carrying the drive and the notebook filled with notes. She watched the recordings carefully without interrupting. By the time the final video ended, her expression had grown serious. The footage showed unauthorized removal and sale of personal property that legally belonged to me. Combined with the lease Daniel signed under Olivia's influence, the recording strengthened the case that deception and pressure had been used to gain control of the house. For the first time since this situation began, I felt something that resembled certainty. The Carter family believed they were safely inside a house that now belonged to them. In reality, their own actions had created the evidence that would reveal exactly what they had done. If you're still watching and want to see how the story finally ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here. Now, let's move on to the final chapters and the outcome no one expected. The legal complaint was filed on a quiet Tuesday morning in Charleston County Court. I remember the date clearly because the air outside the courthouse carried the first cool breeze of early autumn. The paperwork listed every detail my attorney and I had gathered. The lease agreement Daniel signed without my consent, the pressure that led to it, and the recording showing Harold and Linda Carter removing property from my home. Seeing everything written so formally made the situation feel both real and strangely distant. What had begun as a family disagreement had now become a legal case. The official notice reached the Carter family within a few days. According to my attorney, the documents required them to respond to the allegations and prepare for a court hearing if the matter continued. He did not witness their reaction personally, but neighbors later told me that the atmosphere around the house had changed quickly. The confidence Harold and Linda once carried disappeared almost overnight. Daniel learned about the lawsuit shortly afterward. He came to the apartment one evening with a look I had never seen on his face before. It was not anger exactly. It looked more like confusion mixed with disappointment. He asked why I had taken such a serious step instead of discussing the matter again as a family. He explained calmly that the situation stopped being a simple family matter the moment legal papers were signed involving my property. My intention was not to punish anyone. He only wanted the truth of what had happened to be acknowledged. The conversation ended quietly, but I could see the weight of the situation beginning to settle on him. Over the following weeks, Daniel started noticing things he had ignored before. Olivia began talking more openly about money. Her father's debts appeared larger than she originally described, and she pressured Daniel to consider selling his apartment to help resolve the problem. The suggestion forced him to question the choices he had made. Eventually, Daniel began looking into Olivia's past more carefully. The information he discovered matched much of what my investigator had already found. The previous marriage in Tampa, Florida, had ended with accusations about property ownership. The pattern was difficult to dismiss once he saw it clearly. Not long after that discovery, moving trucks appeared outside my house. Neighbors told me the Carters were packing quickly, removing boxes and furniture late into the evening. The same house they once walked through with such certainty was now being emptied in silence. A few weeks later, Daniel visited me again. Distime, his posture looked different. He seemed tired, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. He explained that he had filed for divorce from Olivia. Learning about her attempts to pressure him into selling his apartment had finally forced him to accept what had been happening. He listened without interrupting. Trust does not return instantly once it is broken. Still, seeing my son confront the truth gave me a quiet sense that something important had shifted. The legal battle over my house had revealed more than a dispute about property. It had exposed the cost of believing the wrong person. Several months passed after the legal case began, and with time, the situation surrounding the house finally settled into something quieter and more certain. The court confirmed what my attorney had already explained to me earlier. The trust attached to the property protected my ownership rights, and the evidence collected from the recordings made it impossible for the Carter family to argue otherwise. The lease agreement Daniel had signed could not override the legal protections built into the trust. In the end, the house remained legally mine. Yet, by the time everything was resolved, I had already made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who knew the story. Instead of moving back into the house, I chose to follow the clause in the trust that allowed the property to transfer to a charitable organization. The nonprofit group I selected helps older women who have experienced financial exploitation or housing instability. Turning the house into a place where others could rebuild their lives felt like the right ending for something that had once meant so much to me. Years earlier, after selling my bookstore, I quietly purchased a small farm outside Asheville, North Carolina. At the time, it was only a distant plan for retirement, a place I imagined living someday when Charleston felt too crowded. That small decision eventually became the reason I could step away from the conflict without fear of losing my future. Life on the farm is slower than life in the city. The mornings begin with sunlight across open fields instead of traffic outside an apartment window. I spend my days tending a garden, reading old books, and occasionally shipping rare volumes to collectors across the country. Daniel visits more often now. After his divorce from Olivia, he began trying to repair the distance that had grown between us. Trust does not return overnight, and I never pretended that everything could simply return to the way it once was. Still, I can see the effort he makes each time he drives the long road to Asheville to spend the afternoon helping repair a fence or walking through the fields beside me. The house in Charleston now belongs to women who need it more than I do. The nonprofit renovated the rooms and turned them into temporary housing for those who have nowhere else to go. Sometimes I imagine them sitting on the same porch where Thomas and I once spent quiet evenings together. Looking back, I realized the most important thing I protected was never the house itself. What I protected was my dignity. Sometimes life quietly places us in moments that test not only our patience but also our sense of worth. It is easy to believe that kindness means always giving more, sacrificing more, and staying silent to keep the peace. Yet, there comes a time when protecting dignity becomes just as important as showing compassion. True strength often appears not in loud victories, but in the quiet decision to stand firm when something valuable, whether it is a home, a memory, or a piece of self-respect, is threatened. Storms in life have a strange way of revealing truth. They show who we are, what truly matters, and how much courage can live inside an ordinary heart. And sometimes after everything settles, we realize that the greatest victory is simply refusing to disappear. Thank you for spending this time listening. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing to follow more stories like this.